Now we often talk about creating travel corridors on client properties and our own properties to connect features where you want deer to travel by a tree stand. And there's a lot of different ways to do that, and there's varying degrees of quality when you do that, and varying degrees of priority for doing this too. And so I wanted to tackle this and really talk about really connecting the dots. And it's amazing how you can make deer move right by your tree stand, but it might be a lot different than you think, because just because you cut trees a certain way and you leave this opening and create a tunnel for deer to walk through doesn't mean they're going to actually walk through it. And so it's really important to understand why you're connecting these dots in the first place, how you're doing it. And I brought up some points with travel corridors for bucks and cruising bucks. And a lot of times that's what's using these deer trails are cruising bucks, because they're going side to side. You're connecting bedding area to food source. Now does might hit that travel corridor on the way to a food source, but if you're looking at travel corridors between bedding areas, likely that's cruising buck during the rut. And so you're specifically creating these for cruising bucks and making sure they're in a spot. And you know, a lot of times I look at their different levels of priority when we look at a client plan, and this is a little bit lower level. And the reason I say that is because we should already be matching our habitat improvement recommendations to the lay of the land. So where deer would naturally cross through a saddle on a ridge or on a bench around a point or on the bench on the side hill, that's where we're trying to put stand locations and connect habitat features of water holes, food plots, bedding areas to begin with, mock scrapes. And so there's a lot of other stories for why a deer should go there. And so if your travel corridor is a story, meaning this is why they're traveling from point A to point B on this, and that's it, then you might not get a lot of use out of it, because there really should be some other reasons. No different than if you're scouting public land and you're looking for a movement between that big oak flat where deer are feeding in the early season, mid-season on acorns, and this bedding area down here in a marsh. What features are the deer going to travel to get from point A to point B? That's where you're setting your stand location. The difference is on private land, you can enhance that a little bit, and enhancing that a little bit is what we're going to talk about. No straight line. When you're creating a travel corridor, deer do not like straight lines. Straight lines equal people. So that's why we recommend straight lines for access and a little bit curvy lines just gently flowing through the habitat for actual deer. You know, we're not making these road width where you can drive a truck on typically. We're making them on average probably 2 feet, 3 feet at the most, where deer feels comfortable, more like a quote deer trail. Really important to understand that. Have to understand the balance of the region. Deer don't like to be confined in really short or small tunnels, narrow tunnels in a northern setting where there's predation. Those predators will use these trails just like deer will. And so if a deer can't see very far outside of this, it's just really narrow and tight, say a 2-foot travel corridor width, you have too much debris and logs built on either side, which we'll talk about, then the deer will avoid it. So really important to just use really, you know, you balance this to the region. I would say like even in Kentucky where it's big woods, big open area, thinking of rolling hills, if you try to, and deer have space, maybe a non-ag area. If they're used to space, meaning they can go anywhere they want, buck movements are a little bit larger during a daytime period, they travel a lot further during a 24-hour period, because there's not a lot of great habitat, then you'll find that these cuttings and these widths of travel corridors need to be a lot wider. Now on the flip side, if you're in northern Ohio and it's a coverless ag region where there's hardly any cover, deer are used to being confined in very small, tight corridors, and so you can get away with very narrow passageways for deer to travel on that are only a foot, 2 feet wide, and they'll slip through there to go from point A to point B, and that'll be reflected how you make these cuttings. Stand locations are always at, so a lot of times we're making a travel corridor on the outside of a property, meaning 50 yards in off the border. We access on the border to a stand location. And so I'm looking for, there's always deer that are going to be coming on and off the property. So I'm looking for that intersection. I'm looking for where a natural trail hits the travel corridor. That's where we're placing our stand. So anytime we can, again, we're using natural lay of the land and natural deer travel routes to place a stand. Now when I'm building this corridor, we're adding a mock scrape right over the travel corridor at bow shot right in front of the stand. No more, no less, just one right there. So every deer that goes by at hip level with a hanging vine or a hanging branch, you can leave their scent. If you want to learn more about mock scrapes, I have over 60 mock scrape videos that you can look at and check out. But bottom line is we're putting those right in front of the stand. We always pick a spot for a camera if we want to add a camera there too. So you're picking a camera tree, scrape tree, and stand tree all at the same time. But you always find the tree first you're going to hang a stand in, and then build the travel corridor. Far too many times you want a stand location in that spot. You've taken a lot of time to put a travel corridor on, and you're just 10 yards off for a bow shot from a great stand location. So always pick the stand location first, and then build that travel corridor within 20 yards, 25 yards at most of that stand location tree, and then continue on with your travel corridor. So again, pick your tree first. So we're going to talk about a few of these. Open woods. So a lot of times we have open woods right here. This is kind of a brainchild of Dylan. Some of the illustration here.
I think it looks good.
Yeah, I think so too. Hey, thanks for watching the video, and we'll be right back. But this is very important. It's a very important announcement. We have our Camp Kicking Bear event. We have it on Father's Day. It's more of a habitat day. We're going to see a feature of habitat improvements, how they will all relate to a bedding area, a water hole, food plot, bedding point, morning stands, evening stands, and then we get to take a tour around the majority of the property too. Bottom line is $350 per person times 50 people. We highly encourage you to bring your kids. After all, it's Father's Day. Those 50 spots always sell out very fast. On that same day, it's from 10 o'clock to 4 o'clock in the afternoon. We have speaking events. All my sponsors kick in for that. So we'll literally be giving away a Matthews boat, a ghillie blind, and so one person will win each of those. For about 13, 14 people will win really good prizes. I could list them all, but check it out. We also have our $100 times 100 hunt raffle to a lucky hunter that'll come hunt with us the end of September for 3 nights. So really check out all that information. Look at the link in the description. You can ask Jessie. She'll help you out with any scheduling of that, and look forward to seeing you guys there. It's a great event. Every dime that's earned goes directly to Camp Kicking Bear, and even a little extra on top of that. So look forward to seeing you there. But you're weaving that trail through open hardwoods. So a lot of times when it's big open hardwoods, deer are used to space. So if I'm cutting trees out of here, I might cut one close, like right here. You want to cut that perpendicular to the trail. You never want them to feel like they're in a cattle chute. I've seen trails like for hoops. They have hoops over the top of a trail, deer trail. They actually made hinge cuts and tied them over. And all the buck signs on the outside, because the buck doesn't want to stoop down with big antlers and be caught in this tunnel for 200 yards on a ridge top. I've literally seen that before. They'll avoid it. I've seen tunneled trails where there's cuttings on both sides parallel to that travel corridor, and the deer can't get out. They don't like that either. So that's where you have perpendicular cutting. So I might cut one close that might be 10 feet, 20 feet off that trail. But then I'm going to cut one further away over here. That might be 40 feet away. You might have one over here, one over here, one over here. So not a lot within 10, 20 feet of the trail. It's just a gentle suggestion, something that actually browses and over. And what's nice when you have big open hardwoods like that, each tree that you're cutting down, you're cherry picking, as this one will fall for the most part away from the travel corridor, but it's letting a lot of sunlight in too because they have big tops. So you don't need a lot of cuttings. It'll thicken up the area. The idea is the deer can walk through this. They have regen on either side. They feel safe. You can't see into that trail. They can't see out other than just a filtered look, but they can escape in any direction. So if a deer wants to travel through here and escape this way, he can. If he wants to escape up through here, he can. There's many different routes they can come in, but overall, you're connecting point A to point B. You determine what that point A, B is. Food plots, bedding areas, and then this might be a natural bench area, it might be a saddle and a ridge top, it might be an inside corner of a woods. It's areas that deer would want to travel anyways. You're just narrowing it down so that you can have a stand location and get a shot within 20, 25 yards of that. So that's more open hardwoods. When you get into tight woods, this is where I think it makes it a lot harder because people have a tendency to just cut every tree down within that. I'd rather see trees that are cut off more, quite a few, but more a little ways off that border. So when the deer are going through, it's not this hinge cut, narrow opening on both sides where a mature buck that's used to a little bit more space feels really reluctant to go through. Now, if I'm in Ohio and it's that coverless ag region, I might make those cuttings a little bit tighter, knowing that these deer might tolerate that. But in the average setting, I'd rather leave a 10-yard gap all the way through. And we did that out here on our property where we basically parted the aspen in the area where left about a 10, 15 yard gap, parted the aspen to the right, parted them to the left, and that'll connect bedding features with exterior stand locations and an interior stand locations for that bedding area. We're just turning the deer right through that cutting, and we chose to keep those away because we're using aspen. We had aspen to cut down there, and there's so many trees to cut. Where if we cut them right on top, it just seems unnatural to those deer. You're not going to fit them through just this really, really tight window with a bunch of big logs where it's only 5 feet wide. Immature bucks will generally avoid that, and especially avoid it in up north areas where there's a lot of timber. Now, tangled mess. This is interesting right here because same concept, you're dropping trees perpendicular to that travel corridor, but in a tangled mess, like after a logging operation, you want to make sure you have a continuous line that you're cutting out 3 to 4 feet wide, and that deer also have those perpendicular escape routes. Because it might be after a logging operation or indiscriminate cutting, you're just trying to get canopy reduction, but you want that travel corridor going through. That means you might have to open up a right or a left where deer can escape perpendicular at travel corridor every 10, 20 yards. Again, they don't want to be tunneled in where they're in this tunnel for 100 yards and they're sitting ducks for predation. So you want them. So what you're looking for are opportunities where there's a hole to the right, I just need to cut that log out and the deer can go that way. And that's how you increase the use of that travel corridor through there. Now when you come down here, you have grasses, shrubs, briars. What's really nice about that is that type of region, deer are already used to this type of habitat. If they're using it, it's a matter of you just going in there and creating a trail. Now sometimes it's so thick in those kind of areas, going through with a 6-foot brush hog or 5-foot brush hog might be an easy first thing to do. Then you can let that grow in a little bit thinner. A DR brush trimmer is perfect. Those are 28 to 32 inches wide. Walk behind, little mini brush hog, just walk behind like almost like a rototiller. And those are great tools for creating brush hogs we've had clients use for many, many years. But you still have to cut out the logs. Imagine on any of these travel corridors, now granted if there's rocks or it's wet, there's not much you can do about that. But imagine that you could literally ride a mountain bike through all of this. Meaning there's no logs, there's no debris. You can easily lock it. You don't have anything hanging over that's going to fall and ruin your travel corridor. That's why I don't like hinge cuts over the corridor and things like that. That was kind of old time thinking that I really don't like to support, because once that caves in, it can ruin your whole travel corridor. And so you don't want the opportunity for that. It's something you want to clean and maintain once a year. It's something you go cross-country skiing on. You can look for sheds in the off-season. You can go snowshoeing on in the off-season. Something you can easily navigate through. But once you get into about a month outside of the deer hunting time, that's a time where you hold back and you just let these develop for all deer all the time. And they can be a perfect addition to your property, creating this corridor. But like I said, a lot of times we leave a client and their head is spinning. They have timber to cut for bedding areas, they have food plots to put in, they have stand locations and stand location access routes to develop, mock scrapes to put in, water holes. There's a lot to do, there's a long list. I would put most of those above travel corridor, only because if you're connecting habitat features, you're connecting those habitat features with the natural lay of the land, and you're installing those evenly throughout your property, then deer will start to develop those travel corridors that you want them to travel, because they're a natural flow from one habitat improvement to the other naturally. So out here in Wisconsin, we have travel corridors that we've developed, but they're specific locations. We wanted to funnel deer better through a cutting or around the side of a point. So they're shorter stints. It's not like we've made a travel corridor all the way through 3 miles of edge habitat. Instead, they're short stints for 100 yards long to direct traffic when deer are in the area to a specific stand location. And it's more of a complement to everything else we're doing instead of the habitat improvement. Again, if your travel corridor is the habitat improvement of why deer should be in there in the first place, you probably need to rethink it, because that travel route and that stand location, there should be a lot bigger story than that of why a mature buck is traveling through there, meaning a convergence of trails, a natural lay of the land, saddles, topographical features that funnel deer, changes in habitat, changes in age of habitat. There's a lot of other things that can come together to paint the picture, not to mention it's between a food plot and a bedding area and a water hole, things like that. So Dylan, anything to add with travel corridors, or do you think that's pretty good?
No, I think that's great. I just think they're, like you mentioned, maybe not the first thing you think about, but I do just like how they make travel between stand locations and improvements so much more predictable. And adding a water hole or a mock scrape on there just really tightens that up right along those travel corridors. One thing for the tight woods thing that you could mention is using like a forestry mulcher, something like that, a piece of equipment.
Especially in those like mid-age aspen where it could just mow them out of the way.
I had a client, Brandon, in northern Minnesota that I was literally drawing up his plan, and he's like, hey, would you mind just sending me those quick? And while I was drawing up his plan, he went and made them in a forestry mulcher. And I just saw those again 2 years later, and the deer have highways down them. So it's really cool to see that come together.
That's awesome. Even like tag alder areas like that and low brush areas, they're awesome.
Oh, yeah.
We can even mention too, a lot of times spraying this with a ground clear herbicide is not a bad idea too, because so you might clear that 6 feet wide, but then you go back in with a wand on a backpack sprayer and just spray that to about 2 feet wide down to the dirt. Deer are very visual creatures, so when they see that dirt path winding through the brush, it's often something they can't resist. And that's why we putting that mock scrape right over the trail, because imagine every deer that comes by, they have to leave their scent or hit their head on it if they're walking by. And that's, I don't put the water holes on the travel corridor. I put it just slightly off to the side. So a few other points about that. But
maybe one thing that you could add here would be that maintenance on these. I feel like these sound like a very daunting thing. And people are like, wow, do I have to do that every year? No, you don't. Clear it, maybe walk it once a year to make sure
just go for a walk.
Deadfalls. But really the deer will keep them open. They'll browse them down so that they never really close back up.
And that's what's nice too when you have this narrow. There could be several trails in an area, but when deer key on these, they're leaving urine scent, pellet count, and rubs and scrapes. And so it really defines where bucks travel through the area. And again, it should be connecting natural features anyway. So a lot of times you're not reinventing the wheel. And if you do in a lot of locations, that's why we're adding food plots where we do. It's part of their natural flow. You can picture deer moving through that, especially little hunting plots and water hole locations, mock scrapes. That's why we have a stand location there in the first place. Again, you know, you're trying to find these conditions on public land. You're just building it on private land, and that's why we use travel corridors. And we say it's a lower priority, but it's one of the top 5 priorities we talk about with a client. So even if it's number 5 or number 4, depending on the area, and sometimes it's number 2 because if it's in those brush areas, it's just so easy in thorns to make a trail, and the deer will follow it easily. So it's an easy habitat improvement for people at some points depending on the condition. But bottom line is it's one of our top 5 priorities, and it might be for you. And I hope this makes sense of why you'd make one type of trail in one location, one in another, one in areas of high predation and northern settings, and one in low cover regions like northern Ohio versus the UP of Michigan, for example. So try a travel corridor. They're a lot of fun and very rewarding, especially when you're sitting in a stand watching a big old buck walk right down a trail you made for them this fall. Now, I don't know if you've checked out our main website lately, whitetailhabitatsolutions.com, but we've really had a lot going on, including hats, books, our web class, and certainly our new seed company, WHS Wildlife Blends. When you click on seed on our site, it'll take you right to our brand new site for the seed company. We have all 12 blends available. So check it all out though. I encourage you, I appreciate you checking it out. Whether you buy anything or not, really appreciate you visiting the site and seeing what's going on, and continue to watch because we have big things coming later this year.